Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of How To with INKJD. Today I'm going to answer some of the questions and direct messages I've been receiving about my template and what I use for studio work. So I'll just kind of jump right into it. My Cubase session is open here. Then this is just my basic template for things I would do for maybe Ice Nine Kills or other bands in similar genres, and the orchestral work that I do for various types of projects, whether it's sound design for music videos or, commercial audio, things like that. So I pretty much have everything set up in here to just kind of get right to work and jump right into it. So I'll just kind of break it down for you here. And to start, you can see up here I have 3,365 audio tracks, or tracks in general. Most of them are MIDI, and I actually don't use nearly that many tracks at the same time. But what this template is set up for is to have everything available in the session so that when I do decide I want to use something, it's already there and I just click it and enable it. And I'll show you that here in a second. So my favorite part about Cubase and the setup that I use is the folder tracks. You can kind of just categorize everything into place and make it so your view of all your tracks that you're currently using is sort of simplified. And that becomes very much in handy when you're using this many tracks or have this many in a session. So I'll start here with the band folder, and this is just a standard layout for a generic, a festival style band where you have drums, bass, a couple guitars, some lead guitars, clean guitars, and then the vocals, if you have screams or clean vocals, harmonies. And I'll show you kind of what I do with my track layout here. So first thing is my auxiliary folder. I have these 4 tracks set up that are just like little additives, and I'll give you a little taste of what they are. So if I enable those, I have a hotkey for that setup for the letter T, and the first one is a reverse snare, and you can see that right around here is where the transient hits. And what I'll do is I'll cut that little area, drop it in place, and then expand the file like back out to where it should be once I line it all up. And then this one is an 808, pretty generic sub drop of sorts, and I just dropped that where that goes. This one is another variation of the same thing, except this one has way more low content, like all the way down here. It's pretty ridiculous, but most stereo systems that people listen to music on these days aren't really putting out that low frequency content, but it's there for the people who have it and like to enjoy it. So what I'll do is I'll typically take this one, since it's a static pitch straight across, I might throw a fade on the end so it fades out, but I'll tune that to the song. So if the general key or the section of the song is like an F or an A or a B, I'll just tune that sub frequency to that note so it just blends right in where it should. And then this one is a swell, and it's basically a reverse cymbal that just swells up and then has an explosive hit at the end. And this one is actually from my good buddy Dan Corniff. We use this on our Every Trick in the Book record very frequently for like choruses and big impactful hits. And that was a pretty standard thing that Dan put on almost all of our choruses, if not all of them. And I just lifted it from the stems and I use it all the time. So thanks, Dan. That one is just a version of the same thing, but just the hit at the end, so I can have 2 things to work with. So what I usually do is I leave these like that and grab it when I need it, drop it where it goes. And that's my auxiliary folder. Next up is my drums. I use the Get Good drums, and I very much enjoy these, creating a MIDI thing here. And I have my various drum tracks and stuff. I'll spare you the boringness of programming a drum part. But that's set up that way, and I use it through Contact, and I have the basic routing so that every drum has its own track output. And I'll show you here in my mixer window how I do that. Starting down here, we have the kick drum all the way down. The red ones are groups, so it'll send all the toms to the tom sum and the snares to the snare sum, room, mics, paracomp. And this actually was just a basic setup that Misha Mansour did when they first released the Get Good drums, and I've pretty much found that it works perfectly for what I need it for. This whole template is really just a demoing session meant for, writing and composing and putting the ideas together and prepping for a final mix. So you can see that on the drums here, there's a various amount of processing chains going on. Nothing too insane. I try not to get too caught up in that because, again, this is just for demoing purposes. So we want it to sound good and presentable, but, I don't get too carried away with that. So that's basically my drum layout. And just a little more on the drums. I have a hi-hat folder under here. And what I usually do in most projects is I'll actually replace the programmed hi-hat with a real tracked hi-hat. And that's because I find that although drum libraries give you so many options and they all sound really great, sometimes they sound not so great, but that's up to you to decide if you want to use it. But the thing is about programmed drums is that the hi-hat is always the thing that has the most it's most commonly found that the hi-hats can be the thing that gives away the fact that you're using fake drums or programmed drums from a real kit, whatever the scenario. So I give myself the opportunity to replace the programmed hi-hat with real hi-hat. And what I'll do is I'll actually use this mic that I'm using now to talk through, the SM7B, and I'll put that on the hi-hat on the top, and then I'll do like that old mic technique with the XY, which creates the left and right kind of stereo field, but it avoids the phasing issues that you may have once you blend it in with another kit. And I'll put that in like an overhead setup over my head, and I'll just sit here and I'll play the hi-hat, and watch the MIDI on the screen and just program, in a sense, the real hi-hat. I'll play it and record it in, and then take the program stuff out and then blend it in the mix process, and it gives it a little bit more realism. So moving on from there, we get down to the bass. I have these tracks set up, and how I do this is I have a Contact library set up for programmed bass for demoing purposes, and I actually haven't used this for a final, but I know that there's techniques out there that you can use to maybe blend in like a sub generator on the bottom end of a bass, and then use like a programmed bass for the top end to get that clankiness. There's very many different techniques to use, but for demoing purposes, I'll take this this Contact library created by Corey Brunneman and use that for all my programming, for my demoing. And I very much enjoy it. It's very easy to use. It sounds good right off the bat here. I do a little bit of processing to it. If I hide this here, got a limiter on it just to grab some of that top end bite that kind of is a little inconsistent with programming, but it works great for demoing purposes. And then what I have is 2 tracks set up. I have a recording tracking track for dirty and DI. The dirty will be whatever distortion I decide to use with the bass. Most often it's the B7K by Dark Glass Electronics, and then I'll use a straight DI, which for me is my Avalon U5, and then I'll blend those two together. I put a little bit of something on it just to give it a listenable tone, and then once I record it, I'll drop it down onto these 2 tracks, which have my more processed sound to make sure that the take that I got actually will work in a mixing process. And that's the bass. So after that, we have guitars. Same idea, get the guitar tracking track where I record things onto it. And then I have 3 pairs of stereos. I have a left-right double, which is mixed a little bit lower and has a couple tricks to make it sound a little bit wider. And then my third one is just for that extra guitar line that maybe doesn't classify as a lead or doesn't need any effects, whatever it is. It's kind of like an overflow for guitars if I have more. And what I use for these is the Tone Forge Ben Bruce model by Joey Sturgis Tones. I love this plugin. I use it for my guitars for most of my metal projects or rock projects, and I'll print it right from here to a stem, and this will be the actual tone. You know, you can go through with the mic and the cab and stuff, but this has been working really great for me in my sort of digital studio setup here. So I use that for all my rhythms. And then my lead guitars, same idea again, lead tracking for whatever I decide to use. And I use the Tone Forge Menace plugin, which is really great because it sounds really sharp and really bitey right out of the box. Sounds really good just popping it on a track. I did a little work to it, use some of the LA2A style compression limiting to really boost it up. A couple little changes, nothing crazy, and then I'll do the rest on each individual track. I have a delay set up, really easy, just change whatever you want. And then I have the left and right. I have a second pair, a third pair, and those just vary from whatever I decide to use. And then my lo-fi track is I'll have pretty much the same tone and maybe some delay if I decide to use it. But then in my EQ, I'll actually carve out the top and the bottom end of it to give it that radio lo-fi effect. And those are all ready to go. After that, I have my clean, got the clean tracking, and then I have a clean left and right. This one usually changes per project. Like this one, I have it set up for just a clean, maybe slightly dirty tone with some Pod Farm stuff. Throw a limiter on it to even it out. And then have some delay as well if I decide to use that. And sometimes I actually will just turn this off and I'll use it as an acoustic track or whatever. It varies per track. So that's always there and set up ready to go. My screaming is all in this folder, which has the scream track for tracking. And what I'll do is I'll just throw a gain reduction on it by Joey Sturgis Tones. Super easy to use. Maybe make a couple adjustments. That way whoever's listening in the booth can hear it on their tracking track with a little bit of processing so it's not so dry, and kind of helps amp up the vocalist, whatever they're doing in there. And then I have 2 pairs basically of the same thing. I have a center double left and right, and then I have a second pair. And the reason why I have a second pair is because sometimes you'll have a line that overlaps another, so I'll have that ready to go to just kind of jump between them and then doing different layers and stuff. Sometimes I have a third pair, but usually I get the job done with 2 pairs. And then there's this third track, or this last track rather, where it's just a scream effects, and it varies. Sometimes it's like a really tight slapback delay, or I'll throw extra distortion on it with the Camel Crusher, and then I'll still use the gain reduction as a basic underlying plugin for that. So the vocals, pretty similar to the scream kind of layout. I have the clean tracking track, and then I have I'll show you on that as well. I use a little limiter and the Vox, RVox, for some extra processing so that the vocalist can, again, hear things with a bit more processing so they don't feel so dry and exposed. And then I have a tuning and export track, and my tuning track is after I track the vocalist. If I need to tune it, I'll drop it on this track, and then I'll run it through Auto-Tune, which will show up. Oh, there it was. Come on. I'll track it into here. I'll do the tuning, and then I'll record it to the export track, which again has the same processing as the clean tracking, so we can hear it once it's tuned how it normally would sound. And then from there, I will drop it down here on whichever clean or harmony track is available. or wherever we decide to put it. And same thing as the scream track. I have a vocal center, left and right, double, and then I have a second pair of the same thing. And the last one is a vocal effects, where it might have just a characteristic style delay or effect or flanger or whatever I decide to use at the time. So my vocal process for demoing and actually tracking, once it comes down to making the tracks for the record, is I'll do a center and a hard left and hard right of the same vocal to really make it thick. And then I'll do a harmony track down below, whether it's just in the center like this one, or I'll have left and right and then a second pair of the same to match the second options of the clean vocals. So the last thing in the vocal chain here is the reverb and delay. And I'll bring up my mixer again so you can see how I run that stuff. I have to actually enable these tracks again. So let's enable a few of these, and we'll enable a couple of these. So my vocal chain starts here. You know, I'll have the doubles grouped and these two grouped. And unfortunately, a strange thing about Cubase that I have not figured out yet is that when I transfer my projects from one computer to another and jump around and stuff, whatever I saved the group settings at, where you can link the tracks together, sometimes it changes on me. It's kind of weird, but you get used to it. So let's pretend that these are vocal double group and harmony group or link. So vocals here will go through actually no processing. It'll get jumped to the clean vocals channel, and then it'll all get processed here. I have a limiter set up. I also have the TubeTech CL1B set up. And the harmony does the same thing, but it goes to its own track right here. And then both of these get sent to the all vocals track, which just has a final last stage limiting. And there's some EQ processing. The scream tracks you can see get sent to this one that has you know, a limiter. It's got Joey Sturgis Tones clipper on it, and it has the little distortion. It's got a little extra reverb on it from waves. And then I'll have a delay here that I'll pop on and off like through automation to, you know, have little spots where it does blah, 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 you know, whatever the case is. So from there, it goes, the screams stay here, and then all vocals go here, and then they separately go to the stereo out themselves. And from the clean vocal and the harmony, that's where I send to the reverb and delay effects buses right here. And you can do lots of different delay and reverb automation tricks and stuff that way. And it works out very comfortably for me to do it that way. So that's the basic layout for the vocals. And you can see the same principles apply for the guitars as well. The bass, once it goes through the dirty and DI process, once I actually track it, it'll go to this bass bus. The clean guitars go here, the rhythm guitars go here, the lead guitars go here, and then all of the guitars go to this one. And you know, once it gets to the all guitars, it's just a little bit of limiting to give it some extra life. And that's pretty much the group setup. I did mention that the drums have some grouping that it does there, but then that finally goes to an all drums bus where I can maybe do some lo-fi processing if there's a section I want to do something with, or just to have one fader for it. So that gives us the layout pretty much for the entire band folder. Now the other section is the orchestra section, and this is kind of a monster because there's so much in here, but I try to organize it in a way that I can easily find things. You know, I have my different sections of the orchestra through brass, choirs, pianos, strings, woodwinds, and a few various other things. So starting with the atmosphere folder, it's pretty obvious that that's just like atmospheric things. I have a lot I can add to that. Like I can add a lot of synths and pads to that. And then moving on from there, you have the brass. So this is kind of how I set it up, where I have a brass folder, and then I'll have the developers for each program in different folders. So Cinebrass, and I'll try to keep them color coordinated, so like Cinebrass across all these different other ones would be like the purple folder, helped me find things easier. So inside each developers folder is where it breaks out into the different instruments, and in the instruments is where you start to get the articulations. So I'll just enable those, and I'll make it so that all of them will sense my piano by turning on all the MIDI. And you can see they all have different sounds, and these ones are specifically running in contact. You can do some different microphone technique mixes and stuff like that, and they're all ready to go. So I just enable it, it loads it into memory up here, and you know, I got to keep an eye on that, make sure it doesn't get too high. But this computer has 64 gigs of RAM, so it pretty much can handle almost any amount that I want to do. I don't quite think that it could handle 3,365 MIDI tracks of RAM, so I actually don't usually have to worry about that because I don't build it up that high anyway. But that being said, everything is here ready to go. I just click on it, enable it, and listen to it if I like it, or if I don't like it, swap it to a different track and hear it there. So I'll zip these back up here, and we'll move on to choirs. You know, my favorite choir is the Requiem choir by 8Dio, and I like it because it's got this really cool kind of apocalyptic sound to it. And if you notice, I'm kind of having to relink these sometimes, and that's because my sessions jump from one computer to another very often for my travels and whatnot. So anyway, you have various amounts of Latin phrases. So if I play this, it's very, like I said, apocalyptic sounding. You can trigger these different notes by hitting these red ones down here, which is a different set on the piano, and you can hear. Very cool, and it's the choir that I pretty much use for everything, with the exception of some of the Hollywood stuff, which is right here. And what's great about Hollywood is that you can actually, I'm sorry, not Hollywood, this is the symphonic choirs, which is made from the same developer, but they came out with a new one called Hollywood Choirs. And what you can do in these libraries is you can actually like write down your own phrases in their word builder program, which is, it's pretty cool. You can actually type out Latin phrases, or you can type out English phrases, and it does a pretty remarkable job of emulating that in the sample library. And especially with the new Hollywood choirs, they've developed that even further, where it's like insanely believable. So the symphonic choir stuff is awesome. It's just really a bit more computer intensive than the Requiem stuff. So I use the Requiem a lot more, especially for sketching. The Voxos choirs are really great too. And then just some Olympus elements. These choirs are pretty basic and usable as well. I like those too. The multis folder, this is like really easy stuff, where if you have like a quick project that you're throwing together for sound design, you know. Oh, this one's a little bit quieter, but maybe I can boost it here. So it combines multiple amounts of different instruments that might be available in the library. So you can see it's got full orchestra, choir chords, and it sounds like it has, yeah, full orchestra and choirs. So it's good for like quick stuff. You want to throw something in that has a bunch of layers to it that you don't have to go through and find a ton of individual patches to make that same sound. Now, percussion is where it gets a little nutty because there's so much dividing of different types of instruments. I have the Hans Zimmer stuff, which is a lot of really big, powerful, epic drums, and some various stuff in the East-West Symphonic Orchestra, broken down into different types, bass drums, taiko drums, timpanis, wooden drums, and let's see, auxiliary percussion will have things like triangles and some loops and some sticks, waterphones, claps, stuff like that. The bells are like tubular bells and chimes. My cymbals are like orchestra cymbals or gongs or, you know, crashing cymbals like hand cymbals and various stuff like that. The drums folder will have like bass drums and drum kits and snares and ethnic drums and taiko drums, timpanis, toms from various developers. A lot of Cinesample stuff in here. Cineperc, to be specific. Then I have medals, which is random stuff. I mean, the whole thing about drums is that you can just hit anything. That's what all of this stuff is. So that's why you see a lot of different folders with the bunch of different categories. Damage is a really great program that has tons of different options. Mallets, pretty basic. Xylophone, marimbas, vibraphones, bell trees, glockenspiels, stuff like that. Shakers, you know, tambourines, those like shaker eggs, ethnic stuff. And then you get to the sound design folder, which this is something I use very often. This is another Damage program for Kontakt that I really love. You'll get these like really aggressive impact hits, and I use these all the time. Same thing with this section down here, which is the Godzilla hits made by East West Storm Drum. And I love this one. It's kind of got that like Pacific Rim, Lord of the Rings type of impacts. Very dark. You know, you can throw in this really dark reverb and maybe roll off some of the high end on things. You get this really, really heavy sounding low, almost like off in the distance, scary type Cloverfield-ish sound. I use that a lot, and I love it. So, moving on from there is the wood section, which is like the big mailer hammers and temple blocks, you know, wooden instruments that you would bang together and drum together and stuff. Then my pianos folder, obviously pianos. I use the Bosendorfer 290 by East West for most my piano stuff, but I have a lot of different options to choose from. If it's, you know, a bright piano or a dark piano or a muddy piano or a broken piano. Kontakt has a bunch of different options, toy piano sounds. I have the music box in there as well, which I treat it like a piano instrument because usually when I write stuff, I write it as if it's, you know, coming from a piano, even though it's a music box. But I keep those all together. Then we have stringed and plucked percussion, which is like dulcimers, Celeste, different like little things that you know you pluck, and symphonic orchestra will have different like glissandos, which are like, you know, running your finger across something and giving that like kind of sound. Lots to choose from for that. And then my strings folder is the one I use the most. Again, it's the developers. Inside the developers, we have the different instruments. We have runs, which are like pre-recorded and stuff like that. Very John Williams-ish. And then I have a full ensembles folder, which is great for sketching. I'll use the sustains for Cinestrings very often. I'll use the Cinestring stuff for sketching because it gives me, you know, the, let's see here if it will recognize me doing this. It'll give me bass, it'll give me cello, viola, violin 1, violin 2, So I can get a full orchestra of strings across the board on one patch. It's great for, like I said, sketching, where you're putting your initial ideas down before you separate them out later into your final patches to control things differently. So the Hollywood Orchestra has great ones as well, but they're a bit more computer intensive. So sometimes I only use those for like I'll actually use those for like a band that says, oh, we just want strings in the chorus of this one song. So instead of getting too crazy with really separating things out, I'll just use a really nice full ensemble string patch for them for their choruses or whatever the case is. Orchestral Tools has a bunch of different string runs that are really great. Spitfire has a bunch of cool, like, blended things of like really heavy low octaves and strings and different articulations relating to that. And then my Woodwinds folder is basically the same idea as the strings, except there are a lot of different woodwind instruments to choose from, whereas the strings have just like kind of 5 sections. These are, piccolos, flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons. It's actually a bit harder to incorporate a full amount of woodwinds into a piece, especially in like an Ice Nine Kills type song or another rock or heavy type song, because there's so many instruments to choose from. And what seems to work best is when you layer them or put them in unison with other things. It adds this other dynamic layer to what you're doing that's really exciting. But there's a couple patches down here that are pretty funny. I've never actually used this one in a song, but it's called Sensual Sax. And I'll show you what it's like, because it's a little interesting, but it's funny. So Sensual Sax has a sex knob, and I'll play with it off first. And you'll have to excuse my poor choice of sexy notes, but you add the sex to it. It's got that like Patrick Swayze vibe from the 80s to it, so I don't know. Could be useful somewhere. And then I have like an ocarina, which always reminds me of Zelda. Yeah, that's kind of cute. Whatever. But if you ever want to recreate the Ocarina of Time soundtrack, figure out how to get the Ocarina of Maya. So that's basically the idea for organizing all these tracks. I'll give you a quick look at my mixer as well. Same idea with the groups. I'll have the brass. I'll kind of break them out through brass high and brass low. That way I can process them a little bit differently. The choirs are just right on their own choir track. Percussion, I have higher, medium, and low, and that's in regards to frequency range. So like triangles and cymbals and bells will all be up in the high, and the mid-range will be like snares and buckets and sticks and mid-rangey stuff, and then the low will be like bass drums, taiko drums, big heavy lower hits, timpani, stuff like that. And then mallets will be obviously the mallet stuff, like marimbas and vibraphones, stuff like that. Pianos have their own. The plucked instruments have their own. And then the strings, what I do is I have the double basses, the cellos, the violas, violin 1 and 2, all bus individually here. And then all of those together will go to a strings bus. And I can process them separately by section. Sometimes I'll treat the lower end, like I'll take some of the low end out of it, or I'll brighten up some of the high stuff for violin 1 and 2, but I don't want to brighten it up too much on the low end, so it gives me that separation. And then on the strings track, I can like compress things all together. And down here are my woodwinds. Oh, these ones here are also the same idea as my strings. I have an effects folder where There's like those horror effects or the scratching effects. Those all get separated here as well, and then go to the strings folder. Now, my woodwinds have their own. The drum kits have their own. The sound design has their own. And then everything gets bussed down to the stereo out. And that gives me the option to control everything separately. So that's the basic idea behind my entire layout here, is just having everything ready to go and controllable when I need it, so that I can just sit down and start working and not have to be bogged down by finding tons of sounds and digging through libraries. I just have them all laid out, ready to go. Just enable them, try it, and if it works, then it works. It's cool. If you have any questions, please, by all means, leave them in the comments below or direct message me. And I hope you enjoyed this layout of my Cubase template. See you next time.